My name is Balaji Srinivasan. I'm a general partner at Anderson Horowitz, and today we have with us Airbnb, DigitalOcean, and Locomotion to talk about the end of ownership. So just to jump right in, I'm going to basically throw out some questions. We will have each of our panelists respond, and then at the end, if we have some time, maybe we can do like an audience Q&A. So just to start things off, how would you please also introduce yourself when I go over. Joe, how do you define the concept of the end of ownership, and maybe give a little background on yourself?
Sure, I'm Joe Gebbia. I'm one of the co-founders and chief product officer of Airbnb, and we've certainly seen this trend pick up in the last 7 years since the concept launched in our living room 7 years ago. I think that there's just been a general trend of what I've seen of the importance of access to things trumping what we normally would have put the value on of the ownership of those things. And I think a great analogy for this is actually the music industry. If you rewind about 15 years ago, the way to consume and to buy and purchase music was to physically own an asset of that piece of music. And of course, we live in a world today where you don't need to own music anymore. It's actually more valuable to have access to all the music you could ever want right at your fingertips.
Okay.
Hi. My name is Ben Uretsky. I'm co-founder and CEO of DigitalOcean, and we're simplifying cloud infrastructure for developers. So the way we think about the end of ownership is we deal with a real physical asset, which is server space and computing resources sitting inside of a physical data center, which empowers online applications. But the idea is that we abstract that data center away, we abstract the server away, and what we present is a computing resource that we term a droplet to a user. And what that's allowed the user to do is essentially use a variable cost approach to building their applications. And it's enabled so many companies to emerge in this new app economy and the new internet that we see spreading across the world. So people from emerging markets are able to deliver their applications faster. As a result, they're able to start businesses, whereas before they had a huge upfront fixed cost that was a difficult hurdle for them to jump. But as a result of the flexibility that virtualization creates and cloud provides to these users, they're able to actually build a business. And the barrier to entry into many markets has significantly dropped as a result of that, and cloud is really leading the way. We are one of the few companies that actually provides that raw server infrastructure that powers the internet. And I'm actually proud to say that in the majority of the servers that we use, we don't own directly either. And the banks actually own those physical assets, and it's not a real, it's not a differentiator for us because it's still the same silicon at the end of the day. It's an Intel processor, it's some memory component and some storage that connects to a network. And what we deliver transcends the physical asset, and it really goes to create the experience for people that ultimately use that product. So we're actually the fastest growing cloud provider on the planet today, and that's because we've built an experience that looks like nothing else that's out there. So by being able to abstract away from the physical world, we're able to deliver a really unique experience to our users.
John, you want to talk a little bit about what Locomotion is and yourself?
Sure. I'm John Stanfield, CEO and co-founder of Locomotion. And what we do is we bring the sharing economy to the enterprise. We work with large groups of high-dollar assets, vehicles, and our target is to get to the 8 to 10 million vehicles that are in fleets across the United States today in large organizations, whether that's university or private corporation, public corporation, or government. We can basically walk in the door and save 20 to 30% on the fleet costs over time, which if you have 1,000 cars and it costs $7,000 to $8,000 per vehicle per year, that's quite a sum of money. So optimizing these fleets is done through sharing and through making the experience of sharing actually better than owning. So we focus on the user experience at the door, making sure that everybody who walks up to a car that needs to have access can have access. And then once they're in the car, making that experience better than owning. So everybody wants to use it.
Right. So, one way also of thinking about sort of the end of ownership concept is it's a consequence of software eating the world, in the sense that, software is about, for example, it used to be manufacturing a CD. So you wrote the code at high fixed cost and you manufactured CDs at very low variable cost. And that's a very common theme, Airbnb, DigitalOcean, and Locomotion. You are reducing fixed costs for people, reducing upfront commitments, upfront prices, turning that into variable cost. So kind of, how is that affecting people's behavior? What kinds of things have you seen, both of your employees and customers, and what surprised you about behavior change? So
kind of like the principle of the sharing economy is to look around and find what's going underutilized and connect that with somebody who wants it. It's like someone from the South just told me recently, oh yeah, we've been talking about this for centuries. It's called need hay, have hay. And you connect those who want with those who have, which we can do now in a way that's faster than we've ever seen. Thanks in large part to mobile, and that there's billions of devices in people's pockets. Thanks in large part to how quickly it is to get ideas into people's hands. And thanks in part to how much trust has been built up on the internet through social networks over the last decade that can now transfer back offline, right? So what we see in Airbnb is a platform where you just put the pieces out there and your community comes to you with this creativity of, well, sure, I have a bedroom, but there's actually 4,000 boats on Airbnb, where boat owners are seeing this as a possibility to say, when my boat's just sitting in the marina going idle, I could actually be leveraging that asset to make some extra money to pay off my cost for that boat. There's also people with, believe it or not, there's 500 tree houses on Airbnb. And one of our kind of classic stories is this couple up in Vermont, this beautiful tree house right in the middle of the woods. If you love autumn in New England, this is the place to be. You literally stay in the trees. They use the tree house to pay off their mortgage on their main home. So it's about like seeing the world a little bit differently, seeing how to reuse the resources around you.
Awesome. Ben, what about you? What has DigitalOcean done? How has it changed people's behavior when they've got turned fixed cost into variable cost?
Yeah, I mean, I can't take all the credit, but I think cloud in general, what we're seeing is this huge shift from the enterprise approach to the user experience approach. And what I mean by that is in the traditional infrastructure space, companies would build out massive infrastructure to try to stay ahead of user demand. And sometimes they did a reasonable job at capacity planning and were able to stock up sufficient resources. And at other times, especially in a holiday season or some kind of peak burst event, maybe a news story or something else that's relevant, that capacity may not always be sufficient for that spike demand. And as a result of cloud and this, where you don't actually own the infrastructure underneath, you're relying on a larger partner who can actually excel at that, you're able to switch the driver, rather than it being the enterprise that's going out and procuring those resources. The focus is now on the users that are actually beginning to use the application. And you can essentially bake an algorithm that reacts to that user demand. So the user is the one who's now beginning to drive the actual procurement cycle, and it's been really useful because businesses are able to operate at a much higher efficiency as a result of that closer parity between what a user is requesting and the deployed resources that they have to match that demand. So, the other interesting thing is that because the experience becomes that much better, it's less about, in some regards, it is a little bit less about the efficiency. So we've seen companies that care less how efficient they run each individual server, but that they have sufficient resources to service that demand. And I think it's interesting because their focus is finally like, let's get out of the building, let's make sure the users are having an amazing experience, rather than, hey, how do we get enough servers in the building to service that demand?
Awesome. John, so Locomotion, you take a company's fleet, you turn it into something where anybody can drive any car. How does that change people's behaviors?
Yeah, for us, it's a little different because the fleet operators generally have the assets already, either ownership or a lease is signed, so the money's basically been spent. So what we find really interesting for the future of fleet is taking that fixed cost and saying, okay, how can we turn this cost center potentially into a profit center? So if you think about a fixed group of vehicles, there's a very determinate time that is used during the day, and you can very easily map that now with our technology in every car, and we can show the owners of these assets where that demand versus the supply of vehicles is, and we can lower that just to at least the match to save them on the overall cost of the fleet. But then we can take it a step further and say, okay, we notice, for example, in the French Postal Service that the vehicles aren't used after 2 p.m. And so we're talking to some of the innovation officers there saying, why don't you start making these available to other entities or to the public and actually make money back on these assets? And that's a very interesting conversation, and really flipping this on its head and saying, here are all these vehicles that you already own. Why don't you make money from them?
Interesting. So, each of your companies, you don't own things directly. You don't, Airbnb, you don't own houses. DigitalOcean, you don't actually own your servers. Locomotion, you don't own the cars. How would you see your core value add? What kinds of things are you adding? Starting with you, Joe.
I think probably for all of us, it has to do with like the mechanics of the platform. Like you don't own the home in our case, but we do own the platform that our hosts put the home on and the platform that the guests discover and book those homes. So behind the scenes, it takes an incredible amount of work to figure out how to make the mechanics of something like this. Like how do you actually get someone comfortable with opening up their home to someone they've ever met? That takes an incredible amount of work to try to figure out. So I think in many aspects, we own the platform, we own the trust between our customers. We own certainly the customer service aspect. There's a couple components, kind of like the railroad tracks underneath it all, that I think we own.
Ben?
Yeah, I would just piggyback on Joe's statement and say really what that boils down for us is the experience that the product ultimately creates, right? It's not so much the foundational elements that go into it, although they do play a huge part, but it's the interaction that a user has that really reigns supreme here. And that's what each one of our companies actually owns is that touch point with the user. As far as they're concerned, it's DigitalOcean, it's Airbnb, it's Locomotion, right? And they associate naturally that product with everything underneath it, right? So perhaps, if I stayed at an amazing villa, I would say, oh, wow, that was a great Airbnb, rather than saying, hey, it's a villa that belongs to John Smith. And
so the branding moves to the platform.
Yeah, exactly. And the brand really is the expression of the product and the experience and the user. And that's, it actually takes a lot of work, like Joe said, to really understand the user's needs. And I think that's something that we really are able to focus on more so as a result of abstracting away the things that aren't really vital to our success.
Awesome. John?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I mentioned experience already, but I think in our case, the user experience actually at the asset, at the vehicle, at the door is essential, because if it only takes one or two experiences where you try to open the vehicle and it doesn't open before you go back to using your own car, and that's a failure on our point. So we obsess about that, and that's a really hard thing to do. It's a very technical solution, which we take a lot of pride in. On the other side of this, I would also say, the industry as a whole, the vehicle side and the owned asset world, has kind of become very distributed because of there hasn't been a great deal of data flowing back to the managers. So they really have no intel on what's happening on the ground in real time. And so being able to show them a way to pull these assets into more of a centralized model allows more clarity across the board from the people who are actually managing the assets all the way down to the user.
Excellent. Yeah. One thing I would also kind of say sort of integratively is that, the code isn't visible, the data isn't visible, but it's very complicated. You guys are writing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code at this point. And that's not tangible to people necessarily if they're seeing it through the website, but they're not seeing the complexity of that always. So then kind of, related to this, as you start, having your purchases become more frequent and more small, you're buying smaller increments of things, smaller rentals of houses or of servers. Community reviews and that kind of thing become more important because you're making more buying decisions. You want to see star ratings in line. So, how do you think about that, Joe, with the context of Airbnb?
Well, I think that was a big learning for us, actually, was in the early days. Like one of the biggest blockers to get someone to try this new behavior, right? Of like, I previously have always stayed in hotels, and now there's this new offering of a home, and who's this person that's renting it out? So to get people to cross that bridge, it had all the classic ingredients of behavior change. And so one of the key things that we learned to get people across that bridge was social proof. It was really showing you that people just like you, ideally your friends, but if not your friends, people who are just like you, they're in your same industry, your same profession, they look like you, like they're using this, they're having a great time. And you can actually track the metrics and see the cohorts of, as reviews were added over time, how the adoption started to get into, we're in the middle of hypergrowth right now.
Yep.
And you can all trace that back to like getting those first proof points of really positive reviews from people.
Yeah, actually, I think it was probably one of the first sites where Facebook integration was actually useful. Where you
totally Facebook integration. You can see where your friends have stayed. You can see friends of friends who are hosting. It just like reduces the kind of complexity of like, do I know this person? We show you one of 3 ways, which you already do.
Awesome. So Ben, with DigitalOcean, you don't have the same kind of problem in the sense that you don't have an untrusted or semi-trusted environment where you're a platform and you're mediating transactions to houses that you haven't personally vetted, the servers you vetted. But the software that people would deploy on the platform is not 100% trusted. It's sort of analogous. So how have you guys solved that, or how do you think of your community?
Yeah, we actually paid a lot of attention to the community early on, and I think that's one of the big differentiators for DigitalOcean is as we focus on the developer segment worldwide, what we found is that there isn't really a central gathering place where everyone can communicate and talk about open source technology, how to leverage it, and what actually best fits the business problem. And the community that we've created, it draws nearly 3 million visitors per month at this point, really talks about the challenges that companies go through in trying to figure out the right software stack to solve a business problem. So because customers and actual, just prospective users are visiting this community and they're finding out the right tool for the job that's vetted by people just like them, rather than it being force-fed and saying, hey, we as the provider recommend that you use X, Y, and Z. They're communicating with each other and saying, I solved this problem using this technology. And we just provide that central communication place, as well as like a rich profile with likes and essentially trust. Can you trust this person's opinion? And the more the conversation happens, the likelier you are to try it. And then going back to the variable cost, since it is so flexible and it's so easy to get started, they're much more likely to try out a number of different solutions for their problem and then ultimately land on one. And the ultimate expression of that community is if the user finally comes back and says, you know what, guys, I tried these 3 recommendations and I ultimately chose this one because it was the best fit. And so other users then learn from it, and it's a repeating cycle.
Excellent. So John, in your case, and correct me if I'm wrong, you wouldn't have the same, sort of reputation, economy kind of issues. But whereas would say DigitalOcean, you'd use kind of the data to say install or don't install the software. In Airbnb, you'd say, rent or don't rent this house. In your case, you guys are using data slightly differently, which is buy or don't buy an extra car. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, or in many cases, maintain the number that you have and just turn the dial up on the number of users. Increase utilization per vehicle, which is really powerful. Something when your first question kind of sparked in my mind was something interesting that we learned at the very beginning was, we built scheduling devices and tools for people to plan their mobility in advance and, ways to communicate with users, et cetera. And then what we found was that most people don't plan at all. And so we had to very, very clearly communicate with the user in real time at the door. So when they walk out the door and they're on their phone or doing whatever they're doing and their head pops up and they scan the parking lot, they see the option and they can walk to it and utilize it. And that was something that was anticipated, but the effect of it was very surprising because more than 90% of all of our rides during the day are what we call tap and go. So people just don't plan ahead. I knew that about myself, but I didn't know that about the general population, which was really fascinating.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like one kind of common theme we can abstract out is sort of, the end of ownership means greater mobility, greater flexibility, greater experimentation. So, you're not going to live in a treehouse your whole life or a boat, but you can actually now go and try it without going and buying it. Then you can also try out a new piece of software, and it's, even if it crashes your thing or it's incompatible, boom, just wipe it and then, get a new one. And obviously one becomes more mobile. So kind of becoming more nomadic, more experimental.
Well, and kind of in that spirit, I remember like my dad growing up always wanted to get a vacation home that the family could go to. And it's like kind of in 2014, he doesn't need a vacation home anymore. He
the
has
whole timeshare
a few
thing.
100,000
right.
to choose from on Airbnb and other sites. So it's like that whole premise, his whole kind of shift, way of thinking has shifted to I don't need to own it anymore. It's more important to me to have access to many, many options.
Right. I mean, like that's kind of a thought of 1950. The idea was to own, the American dream, own large consumer durables. Maybe by 2050 the goal is to own nothing at all and call everything on your phone. Right. So kind of related to that, other industries maybe entering the end of ownership. I have my thoughts, but I'd love to hear your guys. So maybe starting with Joe.
When I travel, it turns out there's actually thousands of companies regionally around the world, whether it's in Europe, South America, or Asia, that have taken the basic premise of the sharing economy and said, like, okay, we see this local problem. Let's just connect people who have and who want in our city. And probably the most remarkable one that I heard of, or probably the funniest one, was I was in Seoul, South Korea. An entrepreneur comes up to me and hands me his business card. And I read the card and it says, "We're a sharing economy company for business suits." And I look at him, and it was explained to me later that in Seoul it's very important when you go to an interview to have a really nice suit on, but it's like a catch-22 because you don't have the job yet, you can't afford the suit. So this whole marketplace has been spun up in Seoul. It's actually doing really well from what I hear. So that if you have an important job interview, you can have access to a really nice business suit.
I have a twist on that. I want Airbnb or some hotel to actually offer suits so you don't have to pack, right? So this way you could just fly over there and not pack, pick up the suit. That'd be an amazing profit center, and then you just boom like this, throw it in the wash.
Oh, the mobile closet.
Mobile closet, exactly. That's right. And then over time, then airplanes could take away the overhead bins if you get enough flying, but that's the long term. Okay. Ben, what do you think? What other industries are entering the end of ownership?
I'll talk about it a little bit more broadly. I think what we're seeing is a shift from a conventional way of doing business where it's a closed system and enterprises and companies are making huge CapEx investments into building out what they consider to be a competitive advantage, or perhaps not even an actual advantage, but a way of doing business. And one of the biggest trends that I think will begin to emerge over the next decade is as enterprises become more aware that these nimble startups provide essentially a better service, a better experience, a better level of infrastructure at the same time at a lower cost than can be created inside of a company, the daring, courageous businesses will go ahead and adopt the new way of doing business because it actually doesn't benefit their user and it doesn't benefit their bottom line. And I think inherently, because we've done business this way for the last 5 decades, it'll be very difficult for many different industries and different companies of all shapes and sizes to make that transition. And so I'm not sure exactly which industry, but I think we're seeing this across the board, is that as technology becomes more prevalent, you're able to really change the business model. And it's important to kind of get your head out of the clouds and really take a look around and make sure that the way that you're building your company today still is relevant in 2014, and it's not predicated on a business model that was developed decades before.
John, what do you think is going to be?
Yeah, very concretely for us, large, high-value assets like dump trucks and graders and things that are not used every day, but sit around for the majority of the year.
Forklifts, stuff like that.
Et cetera, yeah. And again, it's the same problem. There's absolutely no data flow in how these things are being used and no ability to limit them or schedule them in the future. Another very interesting point there is actually licensing. So, for example, you really don't want me driving a dump truck around. I think that's a bad idea. But of course, there are people that are licensed professionals that do that. And so you want to make sure you can not only know where these assets are and make sure they're utilized to the best of your ability, whether that's sharing with adjacent counties or whatever, but you don't want people that are unlicensed and unqualified actually operating the equipment. That reduces or increases your liability when you have, basically the doors are open. So for us, it's really about looking at the next level of equipment that's sitting around.
Interesting. One of my candidates for an industry entering the end of ownership, or that may eventually, is education, in the sense that you have a huge upfront commitment of K through 12, and then 4 years of college, and then maybe grad school, and so on. And with MOOCs and with Stack Overflow and GitHub and all this online help, you can start turning that more and more into on-demand rather than this enormous upfront fixed costs, and learn basically on the go contextually as you need it. So okay, just and we can enter a Q&A in a bit, but. Kind of in a few sentences, what do you think of the implications of this space, this concept, for people in the room, CMOs, CIOs, other executives? What does the end of ownership mean for their business?
I love your comment about education. Can we come back to that?
Sure, yeah.
I feel like you can kind of see the beginnings of what's going on with education happening now. And Sebastian Thurn
Yep.
shared this crazy story. He runs Udacity, which is online education, and he talked about how he opened up an artificial intelligence course to the global audience. They ended up getting a few 100,000 people around the world for the Stanford artificial intelligence course. And he shared an email, which I'll never forget, because this changed the way that I thought about this, about a teenager in Afghanistan, who wrote in to him and said, Professor Thurn, I'm really sorry I missed my homework yesterday. My village was getting bombed, but I was able to sneak into an Air Force base and get an hour's worth of Wi-Fi. Here's my homework. It just showed the great lengths that people will go to for education if they have access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, thoughts on implications? And
Yeah.
Joe, I agree, by the way, if you have thoughts on the implications outside the industry, Jim.
Yeah, I think the variable nature of these costs allows a much greater level of experimentation, and as an enterprise scales, ideally you also have profit that scales along with it, and being able to allocate a portion of that profit towards new endeavors, creating R&D labs, and really trying out new technology, new ways of doing business, and figuring out what the future looks like is something that's really exciting. And many of the companies that are staying relevant today are branching out and trying new ways of doing things. And so I think it's important for us to look around the world and figure out the services that are complementary to the industry that we're in, and take advantage of them to try new things faster and ultimately grow our companies, right? Because if you're not growing, then you're dying. And so I think this is a much faster and easier way to continue that growth.
John, what do you think implications of the space for people in the room?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's very valuable to have all these, in my case, all these mobile sensors roaming around and basically helping us predict how people move and where they move, because the larger problem here is as I experienced this morning trying to get here from Mountain View, is there are just too many people in single occupancy situations. So once we have more information flowing into us about how people are actually moving in real time, our goal is to be able to build models of how we can help reduce that demand curve, basically. And really, that's super powerful, and it affects everybody in this room, regardless of your position. It just sucks to drive on the freeway by yourself. And overall, we're trying to build a massive connected network of vehicles that are communicating with us and with the user. And through that network, we can connect auxiliary services, push deals, et cetera. There's a lot of opportunity there to connect other services, but really being able to predict that demand is it's time to do that.
Excellent. Yep. I would say, my gloss on this in terms of implications for people in the room is any fixed cost that you have, think about how you can transform it into a variable cost. Any large upfront commitment or long-term, kind of contract, can you turn that into something which maybe is more expensive on a monthly basis, but that allows you the flexibility to opt out of it and then switch into something else as your business changes. The other aspect of it, on the flip side of it, is going to mean that your customers are in some ways easier to acquire, maybe, but also more fickle, because they're going to expect to experiment, and maybe your reacquisition costs will be non-trivial, and that's kind of a pain if you're a marketer, but also maybe an opportunity. So I think that's the end of kind of prepared questions. Maybe we can do a Q&A or something like that.
Hey, so I guess a question for all of you, whoever's encountered this the most. So as you've kind of developed the sharing ecosystem, somebody owns the asset, and sometimes that asset is owned by a bank or financial institution, sometimes it's owned by somebody else. And also, there's a whole ecosystem that goes around the asset in terms of insurance, et cetera. Have you guys encountered how that plays into the equation currently, and how you think that's going to evolve to help support sharing becoming even bigger?
I'd say absolutely. I think there's a whole kind of second supportive economy that's supporting a lot of the businesses that we've started. And kind of like an analogy, we work very closely with Jeff Jordan, and he tells us a lot about the early days of eBay. There's a whole economy that started just around eBay to support sellers, right? Like whole businesses formed just to support the whole eBay economy. I think you see the same thing with our industries as well, whether that's insurance, whether that's services. A couple of things that we've had to figure out is like educating insurance companies about what this even is. Right? A lot of them gave us blank stares when we first sat down with them. But now we've actually innovated on insurance policies and programs. And so through Lloyd's and others, there's now sharing economy insurances, not only for homes, but for cars and other things out there that didn't exist even 2 years ago. So I think this is just starting to emerge, all these other kind of tertiary services that support the businesses that we've started.
Yeah.
Go on.
I'd almost take the exact opposite approach, right? And when we look for insurance, it feels like we're dealing with behemoths that have operated the same way for 50 years. And so I think that's like an industry that could be ripe for disruption. I mean, obviously they're in it because they're making a profit. What really prevents us from using a platform like Tilt or any kind of crowdfunding and provide insurance for fixed assets out there, right? I mean, we need some pretty good statistics to make sure we're making the right bets, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from a single enterprise entity. I mean, that's the way the world looks today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where we're headed in the future. And so a lot of times the services are hidden, right? Only a very select portion of the population or even the business population is actually exposed to those challenges. And so while it may not be that frequently occurring, there's a tremendous amount of revenue tied to it. So I think as a result, the opportunity is relatively large.
From my perspective, it's a great question. I think insurance is one of those kind of, in my opinion, pain of ownership. So if you look at the 130 million families in this country that own more than 2 cars, every single one of those fleet managers has pain of ownership, just the same as the GE Capital or whoever has the large fleets out there. Insurance is one piece of that. Removing that pain of ownership is really what unlocks the sharing of this type of asset. And so being able to innovate and create new companies that can help us do that on a fractional, from a fractional perspective is essential. Luckily for us, Zipcar and Lyft and other companies in similar spaces have started to unlock that. And then for me personally, one of the reasons we are in the fleet space is because, generally speaking, that insurance policy is already established for the users that are on the ground today using those assets. Now when we start talking about pushing those vehicles into other use cases, then it becomes an entirely different discussion where that pain of ownership comes back and we need a better solution. We don't have it today. So, but removing that pain of ownership, I think, across our industries is really key to unlocking the sharing economy.
I would also maybe add, to maybe slightly generalize it. So insurance is kind of about dealing with rare error modes, and the more samples you have, the more you can kind of deal with it. And to some extent, you have to just sort of blunder forward, then find this rare error case, and then put a patch in after that. Hopefully, not after like too much bad PR. And the reason, though, that I think we're pretty confident that the sharing economy in general will be able to handle this is that, if there's one thing that the internet does extremely well, it's a very profitable private reputation review ranking system. So, for example, Google Rankings, Apple's App Store, Gmail spam filtering, PayPal and eBay fraud protection, Amazon reviews. These things already happening in the cloud, massive scale marketplaces where all the checks and balances, rare error cases have been set up, and you've got millions of people interacting and kind of sometimes trading, sometimes sending mails back and forth, but basically sending packets back and forth. And what we're doing is we're taking that cloud infrastructure and bringing it into the physical world. And now, rather than packets, it's actually cars and houses and other kinds of things that are now moving back and forth. And certainly there are new challenges here, but the fundamental informational things are things that good software companies have figured out.
Building on that, the first Lyft experience I ever had, I was going back to the office in San Francisco, and I have to admit, I was a little bit hesitant at first, which is kind of strange coming from the sharing economy, but it's my first time doing something. I was like, okay, this is different. I'm in the front seat, I'm fist bumping, right. And the woman, pretty quickly, I learned that she was also a host on Airbnb. How cool is that? So I pull up the app, and I'm like, I find her listing, I pull up her profile, and she has 54 Airbnb reviews from guests from all around the world. And I'm sitting there next to her, and suddenly any kind of anxiety that I had completely melted away.
Right.
And it was like the reputation of her as a host transferred to make me feel comfortable now in her car driving me around San Francisco.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've actually seen a lot of pitches for companies that are abstracting out that reputation from Airbnb, Lyft, TaskRabbit, et cetera, into kind of like a new report card, like a portable reputation score. So other questions? I saw some other hands. You're next.
So this is a question for Joe, but the other panelists can feel free to chime in. So it seems like looking forward at the demand, there's an opportunity for you to actually give advice for where there potentially is demand in a property that is not well suited for Airbnb, and even as a future purchaser, that you could provide data to say if you configured your house or did this type of remodel, you could generate this amount of income and help, you know, supplement, just like the person did with the tree house, paying their mortgage. I think there's stories down in for the Masters that people have really nice homes and they rent it for a week during the Masters and pay for their mortgage. So do you see that as an emerging data service that you guys will help stimulate people to convert to Airbnb properties where they have demand in their area?
I do. I kind of see it like the Economist has the burger index. I kind of see it like our bed index, right? It's like you can look around the world and see where there's supply and demand. It's a great classic marketplace, right? You can actually see where the supply and demand starts to tip for things like the Masters in Augusta, Georgia, or certainly the Olympics, certainly the World Cup, which we just saw in Brazil, where 1 out of every 5 people in Brazil was staying in someone's home on Airbnb. And it's actually great for cities too, in the sense that like it allows them to expand to take on these types of big events like the Olympics, for example, without having to invest all the infrastructure, right, and pouring more concrete to build more rooms for people to sleep. So there's a whole level that we're just starting to get into in terms of pricing data and helping coach hosts on like what's the right price at what time of the year.
Yeah, and this is related, I think, to also a broader trend, which is basically with software we can start to invert the demand function, right? Like you get data on other purchases, aggregate them together, and not just here, but also in crowdfunding, for example. Entrepreneurs can now be told what is profitable before they build it. Teespring also, which you just saw, does that as well. The product is materialized, or it's abstract in the cloud before enough people buy it, and then it's materialized physically. So that's kind of interesting. You had a question.
When we look at the shared economy generally, most of the companies that have emerged and been successful in that space are typically startups that are displacing traditional business. So Joe, you with Airbnb, obviously, and Travis with Uber and the taxi industry and so on and so forth. In terms of a mindset shift that needs to happen in traditional companies like, say, Exxon, Citi, or even an institution like Harvard, should they be thinking about? What kind of mindset shift do they need to kind of be going through in order for their more traditional businesses to start to understand what the shared economy both means for them and how they can kind of start to enter that space potentially?
Some of them are trying to adapt through leveraging their brand. Harvard's a great example.
Yes.
They're really leveraging companies like MOOC or other online portals and leveraging the Harvard brand to really push that quality education out to more people, which I think is super powerful. So if they're smart, they're going to leverage what they've built already and try to push their brand out there. I mean, at the end of the day, you're teaching a physics problem, it's the same physics problem. But if you have a world-renowned physicist teaching that problem and solving that problem, it's a much more powerful solution.
It'll be difficult for them to adapt, though. Some will be able to do it, but like it'll be like newspapers, which have the whole printing presses and stuff, and then you've got a BuzzFeed that's coming in with a totally different cost structure. Okay, looks like that's all we got. So thanks very much, everybody.